Good afternoon, and I want to welcome everyone to the 2021 Virginia Humanities Conference that is being hosted this year by Virginia Tech. I want to thank the many people who helped to make this event possible, the College of Liberal Arts and Human Sciences at Virginia Tech, all of the members at our colleges and universities in the Commonwealth of Virginia who are members of the Virginia Humanities Conference, to Kirk Richardson and Dr. Tanya Marie Heil, who are helping to organize this event as well, to Joe Ford, who directs the Athenaeum at Virginia Tech, to Dominique Francesca, who's a business manager at the Center for Humanities, is helping to coordinate this, and Trevor Jayaraj Samraj, who is a graduate assistant with the Humanities Center. We're very delighted that you could be here today to begin what is a multi-day event that is focusing on democracy, technology, and social justice, humanities in an unequal world. It comes as no surprise to think about that for decades, our global society has treated technology as essentially an issue for science, technology, engineering, and math, or STEM experts. But it's increasingly evident today that technology is actually a comprehensive from humanists to secure democratic institutions and to help us to achieve democratic outcomes. The growth of technologies such as artificial intelligence and cybernetics demonstrate the social, ethical, cultural, and political dimensions of technology, from facial recognition software used by law enforcement to the influence of digital media on elections, or the use of weaponized AI in the military, or synthetic biology in healthcare. All of these are very important ways of considering the relationship between the technology innovation that's shaping our society and its implications for equity, for human rights, and the formation of a just society. Experts from Kai-Fu Lee, the former head of Google China, author of AI Superpowers, has cautioned that the greatest challenge that AI is posing will concern wealth inequality. Ruha Benjamin, her work on race after technology, raises the concern for racial justice given the impact of algorithmic governance. Achille Mbembe, in his Necropolitics, has warned that the digital future of humanity will be shaped by the global history of racism. Yuval Harari, in his Homo Deus, has even predicted that humans will willingly surrender our democratic institutions just to embrace the benefits of algorithmic governance. What's the role of humanities in an unequal world, whose uncertainties and possibilities are especially heightened and influenced by technology? Can global humanities traditions offer any insights? Do the existing and emerging technologies prompt us to reimagine how humanists might conduct their work? Well, joining us today is our keynote speaker, who's going to give the keynote lecture for the Virginia Humanities Conference, Dr. Renee Cummings. We're so delighted that Dr. Cummings is joining us today. Dr. Renee Cummings is a criminologist, a criminal psychologist, a therapeutic jurisprudence specialist, an AI ethicist, and she holds the distinction of being the historic first data activist in residence at the School of Data Science at the University of Virginia. Dr. Cummings is also a community scholar at Columbia University, advocating for AI we can trust, accountable, transparent, explainable, responsible, and principled, as well as more diverse, equitable, and inclusive. Dr. Cummings is on the front line of ethical AI, generating real-time responses to many of the consequences of AI and the impacts of data on society. She specializes in AI risk management, algorithmic justice, AI policy and governance, and using AI to save lives. She's committed to using AI to empower and transform communities by helping governments and organizations navigate the AI landscape and to develop future AI leaders. Dr. Cummings works at the intersection of AI, criminal justice, racial justice, social justice, design justice, epidemiological, and urban criminology. She's also on the board of advisors of the Carnegie Council for Ethics and International Affairs, and she's a founding board member of the new Springer journal, AI Ethics. She's also on the board of Women in Voice, as well as on the board of Inspired Minds, producers of the World Summit AI. Dr. Cummings lectures extensively on AI and data ethics, and she's contributed significantly to the creation of the first ethical emerging technologist certification. Many of her lectures are available on Coursera. She's committed to fusing AI with criminal justice for ethical, real-time solutions that can improve law enforcement accountability and transparency, that can reduce violence, enhance public safety, public health, quality of life, community efficacy, and community resilience. As a thought leader, motivational speaker, and mentor, Dr. Cummings has mastered the art of creative storytelling and deconstructing complex topics into critical everyday conversations that inform and inspire. And we're very honored to have her to launch this conference for us in 2021. I present to you Dr. Renee Cummings. Thank you so much. We're eager to hear your talk.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson, but it's not Dr. Cummings, it's just Renee Cummings. So thank you for that. So thank you for inviting me and including me in this critical conversation on democracy, technology, and social justice, humanities in an unequal world. This is truly an honor to gather with you as we come together in this virtual space, connected through the Virginia's Humanities Conference. I was asked to share a few thoughts with you on democracy, data, and social justice. As a criminologist, AI ethicist, and the first data activist in residence at the School of Data Science at the University of Virginia, my work explores the impact of data on society. Indeed, democracy, data, and social justice is a conversation we need to have, not only today, but every day and in every corner of this world, as we continue to promote and advocate for ethical technology and promote the need for responsible, principled technology and data we can trust. Yet as we dialogue, data brokers continue to scrape the internet, reproduce, repurpose, and repackage our data, sell it, monetize it, profit from it, and our data can easily be weaponized against us. Data being constantly harvested, analyzed, recycled, and sold by governments and businesses, as well as data being hacked, breached, and compromised. At the start of 2021, close to 60% of the world's population, roughly 4.66 billion people across the globe, use the internet, and that figure continues to grow daily. In the last 12 months, 319 million new users came online. That's a lot of users and a lot of data for disinformation campaigns, deep fakes, hate speech, bias, discrimination, mass surveillance, digital profiling, and the targeting of political advertising campaigns and advertising ads just to particular groups. The mining of our browsing history. Social media is now the public square, the civic center, the marketplace of ideas. The news we read, the debates that top the national agenda, the arguments we have, the voices we regard and the voices we disregard, the ideas we celebrate, the ideas we discard, the digital spaces we inhabit are all data-driven decisions, and often these decisions aren't being made by us, but are a direct result of our data profile and what's in it or what's not in it, what's in our data dossiers or what's not in our data dossiers. Democracy depends on data, and data depends on democracy, a relationship that directs the flow of information required for democracy. Democracy also requires a well-informed public. But how informed is the public on the impacts of data on society? What is the meaning of democracy in 2021? How is technology redefining democracy? What role is data playing in the redefinition of democracy? Is data being used to empower or disempower? Is data being used to enfranchise or disenfranchise, to include or exclude? Is data being used to discriminate or incriminate? Are we using data to maximize engagement or increase political polarization? What is this power that data holds? How has data become so powerful? Are new and emerging technologies such as AI shifting power from the most to the least privileged? Is the deployment of AI compatible with fundamental rights, the rule of law, and democracy? We have a lot to think about. Many of our governance systems have been entrusted to algorithms, which are challenging the conventional paradigm of governance. Governments internationally are outsourcing core public service and critical decisions to opaque algorithms as tech billionaires profit from democracy's decline. Algorithmic governance, AI, and big data, unlegislated and unregulated, are constructing new modalities for the concentration of power in the hands of a few. The opacity of algorithms are undermining individual consent. Opacity also undermines accountability, transparency, and explainability, which are critical to legitimacy and democracy of new and emerging technologies, such as AI, which are threatening privacy, associational freedom, and autonomy. In a landmark case in the Netherlands, civil rights activists took an invasive and opaque automated decision making system designed to detect welfare fraud to court and won. The system was found in violation of the European Convention on Human Rights by the Court of The Hague in February and stopped. The case also set a precedent. According to the ruling, governments have a special responsibility to safeguard human rights when implementing algorithmic decision-making systems. But are governments safeguarding those rights? How many of our policymakers and decision makers are paying attention to the impact of algorithmic decision making systems on society and institutions and the relationship between algorithms and democratic governance? Systems must be democratically accountable to all. And how is that possible if algorithms are inherently opaque and these opaque algorithms are being used to produce systems that govern us? We've got to think about that. These computational systems being used to produce algorithms such as machine learning and deep learning and supervised learning, how do they work? Are algorithms deactivating the democratic process at speed and at scale? Data is the lifeblood of new and emerging technologies such as AI. Data breathes life into algorithms. These algorithms become the pulse of data-driven decision-making systems. Crucial decisions across various industries are being outsourced to algorithmic decision-making systems. But why are we using historic data that make the future look like the past? Large data sets are rife with racial, economic, gendered, and disability biases, deeply ingrained cultural prejudices, structural hierarchies, and the oversampling of high needs, underserved, under-resourced communities and vulnerable groups. Data scientists continue to struggle to find ways to debias data sets and make data sets more representative and more democratic. Without the participatory design of data, how could there be participatory democracy in a digital age? We speak about democratizing data. But how do we democratize data given its historical baggage and deep structural issues, as well as the power and privilege inherent in the process of categorizing, sorting, and generalizing data? It is well documented that Facebook's business practices, its business model, played a role in digital redlining, genocide in Myanmar, and the insurrection at the US Capitol. Tech founders seem not to be interested in the work of the founding fathers and constitutional protections, such as new and emerging technologies like mass surveillance technologies, such as facial recognition, that seek to undermine the First Amendment, Fourth Amendment, 14th Amendment, free speech, freedom to assemble, and to petition government for a redress of any grievance being undermined. In the Fourth Amendment, the reasonable expectation of privacy in the 14th due process and reasonable protection under the law. We cannot have a conversation about democracy, data, and social justice without having a conversation about facial recognition and mass surveillance technologies and how they are being used to track, trace, terrorize, and traumatize in a society we call democratic. Invasive and intrusive mass surveillance technologies literally have us cornered. Everywhere we turn, we are on camera, some of us more than others, depending on where the cameras are located, where we go, who we go with, and what we do. A few months ago, there was a startling headline: wrongful arrest by facial recognition because the technology cannot tell Black people apart. A Detroit man was arrested by facial recognition and held in a cell for 30 hours. And not once did the police ask to see his driver's license because they were convinced they got the right man because the computer said so. They believed the technology over their own eyes, although facial recognition has overpromised and underdelivered and has not been vetted for accuracy. Racial bias and gender bias have been revealed in the real world application of facial recognition. Every time we step foot out of our doors, we are in a virtual police lineup because of mass surveillance technologies. The future of policing is criminal justice technoscience, AI tools, techniques, and data, crime data, personal data, gang data, associational data, locational data, environmental data, data from census and surveillance data. The database in criminal justice has had a devastating impact on the lives of millions. Algorithmic policing, geofencing, and geolocation warrants and digital subpoenas now give the police access to us and everything we do and everyone we interact with. In the UK, Big Brother Watch, a nonprofit dedicated to pushing back against unfair surveillance technologies, released video of a 14-year-old schoolboy in his school uniform who was stalked, stopped, searched, and fingerprinted on the streets of London by the police. He was 14. He was shocked and confused, not knowing what he had done and why he was targeted. Actually, he did nothing more than walking while Black. He didn't know he could have refused to be fingerprinted or that he could have asked to call his parents or a lawyer. It all happened so quickly. After he was embarrassed, humiliated, and violated, he was told, everything is okay. You can carry on now. Big data policing and intrusive surveillance technologies are redefining privacy and challenging the definition of public space. Privacy, civil liberties, civil rights, transparency, accountability, explainability, trust, and the redefining of public spaces are all critical to democracy, data, and social justice. In a society we call democratic, we have unleashed algorithms based on historically biased and discriminatory data that circumvent judicial norms and legal precedents, frustrating due process. Mass surveillance happens under the veil of secrecy and without public consent, largely outside the purview of lawmakers, and disproportionately used against Black and Brown communities, minoritized populations, vulnerable and other marginalized groups. In policing, we are now seeing that without reasonable suspicion and without a warrant, Algorithms are doing a lot of damage as they delve deep into our lives. When you combine all of this with the often cavalier practices of law enforcement, then you understand the devastating impact of data on democracy if left unchecked. Misleading data narratives are encoded in algorithms and algorithmic decision-making systems within a social justice framework. I speak about the need for examining the intergenerational trauma locked into the DNA of data, the negative impacts that this data is having on vulnerable and minoritized groups and underserved and high needs communities. We must examine how data sharing and data integration are vehicles of trauma transmission. We must rewrite data narratives that position Black, Indigenous people of color, and other vulnerable groups and minoritized communities within a deficit discourse. We must decode the painful past encoded in data, deconstruct adverse data experiences, and confront punitive usage of data to punish the minoritized and the poor, and propose a reimagining of data through the lens of intergenerational trauma, using epigenetics and genomic theories that decode data and build empathetic, responsible, and trustworthy new and emerging technologies such as AI. Like genetic data, computational data could also be considered immutable with long lasting consequences. We have experienced the painful effects of data that deny Black, Indigenous people of color the opportunity to close the wealth gap through digital redlining and credit scores restricting economic mobility. Digital redlining algorithms continue to code Blackness as unfinanceable. Credit scoring algorithms continue to code people of color as unworthy. Data have long inhibited Black, Indigenous people of color from equal access to resources, federal and private sector resources, denying generations social and economic benefits and mobility. Data discrimination and the extended effects of data's destructive legacy and devastating future are critical to the future of democracy. Minoritized, vulnerable groups historically have been subjected to data collection practices that have been disrespectful, intrusive, and unethical. In AI, training data sets undermine what a resulting machine learning model learns, how problems are framed, and what solutions are prioritized. Data sets are critical to benchmarking, and data have become an organizing value system, a negative identity for some groups, and a narrative of inferiority for communities that have been deeply wounded by data. Data have contributed significantly to cultural, economic, and political oppression, compounded now in the age of AI, with technological determinism and techno-solutionism on course to exacerbate economic as well as algorithmic oppression. Also oppressive is the AI black box. Priority, proprietary rights, intellectual property, and trade secrets, the legal protections of algorithms are taking priority over protecting civil rights and human rights. Mathematically, how do we code democracy? Can we code democracy? To protect democracy, we must advocate for justice-oriented design principles and ethical algorithmic data-driven approaches, interventions, and solutions. Given the dangers of the data design monoculture, we cannot continue to deploy data-driven decision-making systems and algorithms without fully understanding and addressing fundamental challenges, deficiencies, and impacts on democracy. Data determinism or algorithmic determinism could be a reality if algorithms are left unchecked. Data-driven systems and algorithms must be democratically accountable to all. But the growing codependence between big tech and governments internationally continues to undermine meaningful legislation and regulation. What's required is an understanding that algorithms, data-driven systems create a legacy and have the power to deny access, opportunities, wealth, and undermine the development and progress of many groups. Concepts such as social justice, racial justice, design justice, and algorithmic justice are mandatory to ensure human rights and civil rights are protected and to advocate for data rights. Social justice advocacy must create an environment of careful ethical stewardship of data-driven technologies and ensure we remain eternally vigilant and that due diligence, duty of care, and due process are part of the data infrastructure. Informed public debates, public engagement, public awareness, public education on the impacts of data on democracy and how society should respond are now critical. The ethical application of data and the ethical design of data-driven technologies have the potential to benefit all of society. But at this moment, there are inequitable risks because of the painful data narratives of bias and discrimination, oppression, and trauma that continue to be trapped in the data on which digital governance models and digital systems are being built and deployed. Communities, groups, and individuals who already face patterns of structural vulnerability, bias, and discrimination disproportionately bear the costs and harms of many of our data-driven models and algorithmic systems. Fairness, justice, ethics, and democracy require that those bearing these risks are given due attention and that organizations that build and deploy new and emerging technologies address these democratic risks in real time. I thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Renee. That was really fascinating, I think very timely and compelling analysis of some of the high stakes developments that have emerged with the uses of AI in law enforcement and social justice. There's so many questions that I'd love to hear your address in relationship to that. And we are inviting our attendees, our audience, to send your questions as well. So you can use the chat to do that. And we will provide that to Renee Cummings so that she can respond to your questions or comments as well. There are a lot of things that have been happening in the media coverage, some of which you referred to in your discussion and your talk. Among those, the use of facial recognition software that has actually resulted in innocent people being incarcerated and detained because the software indicates that, according to the algorithm, that this was a match for someone who had committed a crime, when in fact the algorithm is not actually functioning accurately enough to identify people. There is the issue of the data training sets that's happening. You have identified both the problems that have emerged from the technology, as well as the potential for the technology to function in ways that actually advances equitable outcomes and justice. And so one of the things that I'm fascinated by is really the very cutting edge and novel aspect of the kind of work that you're leading at the School of Data Science. As you describe your work as a data activist, bringing together multiple impacts and intersections, that is not just critiquing the problems, you're actually offering solutions. And that's actually where I'd like to begin, because it's very customary for a lot of experts who are studying some of the challenges that technology is presenting for democratic institutions and for societies that are concerned with civil liberties and human rights, it's a lot harder to actually point towards some of the practices and solutions that can get us better outcomes. And one of the things that is very fascinating about the work that you're doing is that it's definitely straddling both of those. You're bringing a critical concern for the injustices and the inequity that's emerging from the technology, but you've also been actively involved in working with a number of different stakeholders in order to try to bring some important transformation to the way the technology gets deployed or the policies are developed or the understanding of the limitations of this technology, in order to have an impact on the public that protects very highly vulnerable people from what would otherwise be very abusive uses of this technology. So can you tell us about the work that you've done, for example, with law enforcement, in order to begin to make some impact on the role that technology is playing, particularly for highly vulnerable communities?
Thank you. Thank you so much. So at the moment at the University of Virginia, my work really looks at deploying some pushback against mass surveillance technologies. And the project really investigates the intensity of algorithmic force that's now being deployed on the streets. Also looking at the fact that most individuals don't understand the concept of algorithmic force and are not understanding the concept that now the detective and the undercover police officer is now an algorithm that's doing that job. And what we are seeing is that because there is not that common understanding, because we're not having the public conversations and the public oversight is not there, law enforcement now has the opportunity to play with a lot of these technologies as though they are toys, because the law is always behind the development of the technology. And because we've not really come up with that formula to fuse ethics and innovation and to let designers and developers know that, you know, you can have ethical design and you can have innovation in the same space, what we're realizing is that society is vulnerable. Just not only our minoritized and, you know, underserved communities, but all of society is now vulnerable to the impacts of algorithmic force. And what is required is public oversight. What is required is bringing an ethical approach to the application of these technologies across industries, not only in law enforcement, because it's also being used by corporations to surveil their employees, but to bring that public understanding about privacy, how it's being redefined, that understanding about security, the understanding about your rights and that you do have rights, and you need to really enforce these rights from a personal level if they're not being enforced from a governmental level. So it's just about designing a tool that empowers the community, that makes the communities more resilient, that builds community efficacy, and that lets law enforcement know that there must be balance and there must be a community voice in the ways in which these technologies are now being deployed.
So that's very striking. One of the things that is especially compelling about your own role and your own profile is the way you have been very thoughtful and deliberate in shaping your own expertise to bring together some of the important training and backgrounds and insights to be effective in this space of data activism and data ethics. So I've been very excited about your helping us to launch this 2021 Conference of Virginia Humanities. So obviously we themed this with concern for democratic institutions and the role of humanities and the huge impact that has become very public now on the role of technology. I don't think you could read a major newspaper for 1 or 2 days even today without seeing some major headline that's concerned with privacy of data, or with the role of so-called big tech, or with the implications for bias in algorithmic governance, or something related to that, or the things that are happening with surveillance, tracing, contact tracing, using the technology in order to try to support public health, and the concerns that happen with that. Your own educational background is really fascinating because you were were pretty thoughtful and deliberate in your undergraduate education, for example, in shaping and customizing your training in ways that invested in humanities in your coursework, but also bridging that to different areas of study. So one of the threads that's going to run through the conversation at this conference is how humanities can be impactful and in a way that's legible, so that we get beyond people asking, well, what is humanities and why should I read? And then they name a piece of literature or some philosophy or whatever, not really understanding how that's connected to some of the pressing concerns. Can you just speak to what inspired you to actually make humanities education part of your training as someone who was in college, thinking about what you wanted to do? And I think you were just incredibly perceptive, maybe beyond certainly what I was as an undergraduate, but just in understanding these linkages, because the work that you're doing really embodies very exemplary bridging of different areas in order to make you someone who's actually very effective at understanding the technical side of these questions, the social and political side, and particularly what it implies for our contemporary society as we're trying to address some very difficult social justice questions.
Definitely. Well, without humanities, there is no life, and there is no living, and there is no lived experience. So humanities are critical to everything we do. And now we're realizing more and more when it comes to technology that this whole concept of science being objective and neutral is really a fallacy. And I think more and more we're realizing that what is required at this moment is a human-centric approach to design when it comes to technology. So you are realizing that there is this loud call for that intersection of multiple disciplinaries, an interdisciplinary approach in particular to AI and algorithmic design, because what we have at the moment is just not delivering what society needs. And given that history of bias and discrimination and trauma that's trapped into the data sets, and we continue to see data being used to create models and systems that are being deployed and that are creating harm and further re-victimizing communities, then we understand how critical humanities and the study of humanities is to moving technology forward and into the right places and spaces to deliver the kind of legacy we require as a society.
And again, I just want to remind our attendees, if you'd like to send other comments or questions, if you're on YouTube Live, you can use the comment box on the YouTube interface in order to pose a question. You can place your question into the chat as well. You can also digitally raise your hand in order to pose a question. And we have a live question now. So we'll go to Tom Ewing and take your question, or I think we might need to
it says I can't undo my video, but I'm unmuted.
So okay, so you're unmuted. Right? Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Very much appreciate the chance to hear this. My class is actually on data in social context, and it began just a few minutes ago. So I told my students to watch this lecture, and I know some of them are. But I want to ask a question that's come up repeatedly in our class. This has been accelerated by COVID. But so much of education is now being done digitally. It's being done remotely. Students are interacting with their faculty or their teachers and with each other over digital platforms. All of that is generating an extraordinary amount of data. What kind of concerns do you have about exactly the implications that you were just talking about privacy, about democracy, about equality, in an educational sphere where so much is now being done on digital platforms? Thanks.
Thank you so much for that question. I think for me, the concern at the moment is not only how much is being shared, but for those who may not have the opportunity to really engage effectively on the platform. And in particular, also being someone who spent some time working within the realm of disability advocacy, individuals with the disabilities, and how for many of them, the technology may work in their favor and may not work in their favor. So when it comes to this whole new remote form of learning, a lot of it for me looks at access, those who have access and those who don't have access, and whether or not the formula that's being used is really being used in a democratic way. And if indeed we need to really rethink and reimagine this system as well.
So I'm wondering if you could speak to some of the looming discussions that are happening at the national level about regulating technology. A lot of that is focusing on private companies. We know just not too many years ago, we had significant disclosures about the role of federal government surveilling citizens. So Edward Snowden was instrumental in bringing to light a lot of things that were happening that seemed to be very much in conflict with some of the expert interpretations of the US Constitution around surveillance and the role of the entities such as the National Security Agency. But most of the attention currently is not on government surveillance, it's not on the history of things like counterintelligence program. Most of it is on technology companies, with the exception of attention toward facial recognition by law enforcement. But I'm wondering what you think about some of the discussions that are happening nationally and globally around the regulation of technology. What seems to be a move in the right direction, and what do you think is missing from those discussions and those very public concerns?
I think everyone agrees that there needs to be some measure of regulation. The big question is, what is it supposed to look like? Mm-hmm. The other challenge is that many of the tech companies are more powerful than some governments. Some tech companies are bigger than some nation states. Mm-hmm. And what we are seeing is that many of these technology companies are providing not only the infrastructure, the hardware, but also the software for many of the governance systems being used around the world to make these critical public sector and private sector decisions. So that codependence between governments and big tech is making legislation really much of a fantasy, because we are not getting we may not get the kind of stringent legislation and the requisite levels of enforcement definitely required. The big discussion around this technology at the moment is accountability. Accountability is the discussion when it comes to data stewardship. And we are looking at the questions of transparency and questions of explainability and how these undermine the legitimacy of the technology. So much is being discussed when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and how diversity and inclusion should not only be seen as a risk approach to dealing with the deployment of algorithmic systems, but must also be a rights-based approach in the ways in which we deal with new and emerging technologies. So it's really about letting data scientists and other developers appreciate that where there is diversity and inclusion, you are not only stretching the imagination of something like AI, but you're also able to develop a technology that is more accountable, that is more transparent, and will be viewed within the context of something that we can trust. And trust is also, of course, linked to accountability, as is public confidence. And without confidence and trust, what you get is a technology that creates fear, and a technology that really, when it's deployed, can create more of a crisis than really deliver a solution.
So can you say more about that in terms of the way our educational systems, particularly in higher ed, are shaping the future talent in technology? Because it's very significant that you are working at in the context of a school of data science in a very transdisciplinary way. You just mentioned the importance of developing technology in ways that actually are focused not just on technical outcomes and technical expertise, but you use the phrase that is actually a rights-based approach, that's a justice-based approach. So that clearly is something that is not going to be fulfilled if technology is thought of simply or only as a STEM issue or a technical issue. It's very much about these larger concerns as well. So what does that mean for the way we are actually educating people who are going to be the stakeholders and the decisive agents in the present and the future of technology leadership?
It means that we've got to build ethical resilience in our data scientists, and we've got to stretch the ethical imagination of data scientists, which means that we've got to combine that, approach to ethics that really is inclusive and bring that interdisciplinary perspective. So at the School of Data Science, I think it's critical that we examine, and we've been doing this, the impact of data on society and how real that is when it comes to ethical design and when it comes to really providing the high levels of intellectual confrontation that are required in the design space to be able to detect the risks and to mitigate those risks, manage those risks, and of course to evaluate your systems and improve those systems. So for us to really get, responsible and principled and trustworthy technology, we've got to begin at a place of trust, and we've got to build that trust at the earliest stage of design. So what is required to really extend that ethical imagination is to really embrace a worldview or a cosmology that celebrates diversity and inclusion and really respects equity and ensures that they are all in the early stages of design to really build a consciousness of vigilance. And as I speak always about due process and duty of care being critical to the design of new and emerging technologies.
Now, Renee, you've also recently launched a new journal that is focused on the role of ethics.
Well, I didn't launch it.
Okay.
Springer launched it.
Springer launched, okay. But you're on the editorial board that you're
Board,
serving on
yes,
this?
yes, definitely.
Okay, so can you tell us what the intended audience is? Because this is a very different kind of journal that seems to be very timely in bringing together something that is a topic that heretofore mostly computer scientists, for example, have been involved with, and that is neural networks, software that is based on the mathematical approach to decision trees, is computationalism, and the other things you were just talking about, ethics, the democratic outcomes, fairness, public accountability. So who's the intended audience for this journal, and what are some of the outcomes that you anticipate will emerge from this type of venue for experts to be able to publish their work in?
I think it's for anyone who's involved in data and the impact of data on society. Of course, most of the individuals who are designing AI and new and emerging technologies want a reference point, want something that they could use to really direct the pace of the discussion. What it does, it brings together a range of AI ethicists and data and tech ethicists working just across industries, everything from healthcare to education and everything in between. And what it does is really provide not only best practices, not only perspectives, but it comes with a very unique and creative concept as well, where some of the articles look at other things that are required, like political will and like courage that is required at this moment by data scientists to do the right thing, to create the most amount of benefits and the least amount of harm with this technology. So I think what they intend to do is really bring that interdisciplinary perspective into the space and show how when we bring all these disciplines together, again, we are stretching the imagination of this technology and creating a legacy, something that we can definitely celebrate. And, I'm very passionate about AI. I am very passionate about AI from the startup space and the things that AI could do, its power and its potential. But I'm also passionate about protecting our vulnerable groups and ensuring that we all, as much as we can, get an opportunity to share in the benefits of the technology.
So that's a great segue into something else that I was hoping you'd talk about. And we have a question here. Someone's asking what's the name of the journal. So that was the Journal of it's AI and Ethics.
AI and Ethics, yeah.
Yeah, the Journal of AI and Ethics. We had a question in the chat. So you were just mentioned something that I was really eager for you to talk about. So it's very easy for people today, and you know this well because I'm sure you've seen it repeatedly and engaging publicly, for people to feel one way or the other about technology, and particularly digital technology systems of AI, of algorithmic software, where either they have an uncritical optimism about it, that if we throw these advancements in technology toward the world's problems, it's almost certain we're going to be able to solve them. Or there's a deep skepticism that becomes a type of cynicism, where it's just technophobia, is that here we go talking about technology again. These tech companies are ruining everything. If only we could go back to the day when, and you kind of fill in the blank, some distant time. And it seems like neither of those. It seems pretty clear that neither of those is going to solve our problems. I think it's fair to say technology is not just going to go away, and technology is a broad thing. It's not just digital technology, but it's also true that we can think of multiple examples where we've developed technology systems trying to resolve challenges, and those very systems have actually created new challenges and new problems for us. What do you say to the audience who is very concerned about civil liberties, issues of human rights, and particularly the asymmetric power relationships we see, where highly vulnerable communities, particularly Black and Latinx or trans or queer communities, are subject to these surveillance practices or the data triangulation that targets them, and try to create some understanding of the possibilities for technology to actually be part of solutions. Because as I said in my first set of comments, we see a lot of people talking about the problems. What you're doing is something that's not seen as often, and that is attention toward what the solution space could look like, and even trying to move practically towards some of those solutions. So what do you say to those who have very compelling reasons to be distrustful of technology, and who are at a point even where they have a very pessimistic view on even the possibility that technology could actually play a positive social justice role?
Well, I usually meet a lot of those, and I usually tell them we need their voices in the discussion, because those are the voices that raise particular concerns and risks that must be addressed in the design space and across the life cycle of AI and new and emerging technologies. I also say that it is because of those voices that we can fine tune the technology and ensure that it is more transparent and it is more accountable. And questions such as explainability are really publicly ventilated, and we really get behind the technology. And for some others, I just tell them it's not about fear. It is about being aware, and it's about being educated on the technology. Many people fail to realize they've been using AI and algorithms for quite some time now. They just didn't know what to call it. And there's another group that have been using it so much for entertainment that they don't really realize the power of this technology and also how it could be weaponized. I think this is what is critical when I speak about the need for advocacy and activism and evangelism. It's about public education. And with the more public education and the more informed a public that we have on the impacts of data and society, then we could ensure that those protections are safeguarded, that democracy stays in place, and that we all have, some sort of equal opportunity to experience this technology and to know that, the protections are in place. But we need those voices to keep us eternally vigilant.
So we have another question that is asking about the challenge of ensuring accountability, given the fact that so-called deep learning AI, which is trained on data sets, and these are multi-layered neural networks. So it's a computational approach to making decisions that are so complex that the designers, the engineers of the software, cannot actually tell what is going on in the program execution by design. In other words, with something like a convolutional network, which has lots and lots of layers of decision trees, that the individuals or companies that actually create this software cannot actually explain by design, because they designed it this way. They cannot actually explain. It's so complicated. They can't explain why a given piece of software reached a given decision. And so the question that we have from the audience is, in this kind of situation, how do you deal with the category of accountability if software has actually been designed to be so sophisticated and complex that, or explainability, maybe I should say, which would be related to accountability, that it's so complex that even the companies that create the software are not able to explain the decision tree?
And that is definitely one of the biggest questions now being discussed across just about every AI think tank, probably in operation. That question of opacity by design and how it undermines accountability or the ability to thoroughly investigate and interrogate algorithms and look at the ways in which decisions are being made and not being made. And that is why it is so critical, particularly in the criminal justice space, when we have algorithmic decision-making systems making decisions about arrests and sentencing and parole, and individuals who are facing a parole hearing are being faced by these algorithms that are continuously misbehaving, or risk assessment tools that are being misused, and that inability to really challenge the black box because of the intellectual property or the trade secret or the proprietary rights that are being given this priority over our civil rights and our human rights. And the fact that one of the fundamentals of criminal justice is that ability to face your accuser. But when that accuser is an algorithm, what do you do? So even from the criminal justice perspective, what we are saying is, when practitioners or individuals working in the criminal justice system are procuring these technologies, they have got to know the right questions to ask. They have got to know what they are procuring, what these things have promised, what they can or cannot deliver, and how these things could frustrate due process. So that question of opacity by design is one of the biggest questions right now. How do we increase accountability, enhance transparency, get behind explainability? How do we do things in this unregulated space? And given the fact that many of the designers of the technologies and the tech companies behind these systems really don't want you to get into those systems as you need to get into it. So it is one of the biggest questions of our time. And I'm actually on several groups that are really discussing that and trying to find a way in which we need to really legislate this and bring more accountability to the space of AI.
So another question we have: does AI have a culture? In the way that a person might have a culture to inform their identity. Culture seems to be an important factor in ethical decisions. So is there a culture of AI? And that sense of culture, of course, obviously can be read in multiple ways, from the culture in the sense of the people who design it, the culture in terms of the institutional context in which it's deployed, a culture in the sense of some of the, you just referred to a legal climate, a jurisprudential climate in which there is a certain mode of operating around intellectual property that I'd like to circle back to if we have time, because yes, that is an incredibly complicated area. But does AI have a culture, Renee?
I think it does. What exactly it looks like, I think the jury is still out on that. And I think in a few years, when we look back, we will really see the culture that has been created. But there are certain things that it's doing. It's creating systems that are culturally oppressive, and it's re-victimizing and marginalizing communities. It certainly has a culture there's certainly a culture in the tech design space, that design monoculture, that's creating many of these systems that lack a diverse and inclusive perspective. When we look at the technologies that are being created, also there's a culture attached to that, the things that get funding and the things that are refused funding, the individuals who are funded and the individuals who are not given funds to build the kinds of technologies they may so desire. So it's definitely creating a culture, but what we want from the space of AI ethics and the space of data activism is to ensure that those robust and rigorous ethical safeguards and guardrails and protections are in place, because what we don't want is a culture of harm. What we do want is a culture of benefit and a culture of equity.
Mm. So we have another question. Thanking you for your talk and really appreciative of your emphasis on education. The question is, in addition to collaborating with data scientists to rethink algorithmic design, there needs to be a well-informed public. How do you approach getting the public the information and knowledge that they need, especially considering what we think of as the digital divide? And there's acknowledgement of the nebulous nature of the public, because there are many publics out there. But you can work with any of those possible meanings about the public that are relevant for you. How do you communicate this essential knowledge to those audiences?
Well, I think I've been trying, and this is another avenue, sitting here and doing and having this conversation.
Yes, the Virginia Humanities Conference.
Right? It's definitely a space of reaching many publics. I mean, over the last year, I think I've done really an extraordinary amount of talks and lectures and panel discussions. But sometimes I feel that we are a group of people speaking to each other. The challenge is, how do we get on the ground? How do we distill this conversation onto the street? We have individuals who are in contact with the criminal justice system and who have been the victims of risk assessment tools predicting reoffending or facial recognition technologies, individuals in the communities who have experienced the negative impact of data in society, who are already having the conversation. But I think what we've got to do from a public oversight and civil liberties perspective is really bring the conversation to the street. And that's what I wanted to do and what I hope to do and what I still plan to do when I created Urban AI. But of course, COVID happened and so many things shifted that my focus moved away from that. But that is definitely where I'm returning, which is building that nonprofit, putting the conversation at the street corners, at the places that we need it to be, and building that kind of understanding, because that's how we're going to protect democracy, by everyone talking about this and everyone understanding that, you know, we have a role to play in how this technology is designed and deployed and how it impacts us and what are those benefits and are they being shared. And I think most people hardly realize that there's a data profile created about them already, or that, you know, your data is what big tech has used to really monetize and to profit. And when you start to talk about the weaponization of data, or something like a geofencing warrant or a digital subpoena, I mean, people wake up because they're like, okay, I didn't know this could happen. Or when you tell someone, even if you are in the most private space in your home, you are still not private, and your privacy is not protected once that phone or, the Internet of Things is in existence. So it's a conversation that needs to be had. And I don't know how soon I'll be able to hit the streets, but I will certainly hit the virtual streets of Zoom and any other platform to start, to have more of this conversation. And it's one of the reasons I do what I do, because I love having conversations, and conversations are critical. Conversations change lives, and we really need to ensure that it's distilled, funneled, and, disseminated in as many places that we can find.
And could you just elaborate a bit further about the vision for urban AI and what you would like to see this do in terms of its public engagement, accessibility, and communicating?
Definitely. So with urban AI, it really is a response to the smart cities model. And one of the things that the smart cities model has done, it has really left out the people who populate the cities, because mainly in our urban spaces, we have a lot of our minoritized and, marginalized and underserved communities, but nowhere in the formula, nowhere in the business model or the plan for the smart city are these groups. And they have a critical role to play in how these cities are going to become smart, the communication technologies, the ways in which new and emerging technologies are deployed. So a critical aspect of that work was really looking at that smart cities model, as well as working from a criminal justice perspective, because that's many of our minoritized or undocumented communities come into the space of this technology, because they have been impacted and their families impacted in real time. So urban AI was bringing an urban understanding to artificial intelligence, and really bringing an urban engagement. And it's about not only advocacy and activism, but it's also getting some of those resources into those communities. So solutions can be community driven and culturally responsive and culturally relative, because critical spaces need to be, explored when it comes to the deployment of AI in an urban space. And urban AI is about bringing that consciousness and bringing that vigilance and bringing that critical awareness that's required, and that says the community must have a voice in what is being designed and deployed.
Yeah, no, that's very compelling. I think that is, it seems obvious once you explain it, but I've not heard it put that way before, that the smart city model has not actually been informed by the most of the population of these cities, increasingly marginalized communities. We have another question. Is it too late to regulate these huge monopolistic tech companies to stop them from exploiting their users through surveillance capitalism? Lots of work examining the role of the monetization of data, the incredibly unprecedented scale, really, of market valuations for these companies. Apple became a $1 trillion company back in 2018. 2 years later, became a $2 trillion company. By the time they did that, there were over a half dozen companies that were $1 trillion plus companies. So there's definitely an immense amount of size, of growth, of influence that these companies have. So someone is asking, is it too late? Is the genie out of the bottle? Has this horse just left the barn? Or is there actually some time and hope and strategy for transforming the sphere of influence, or shaking up some of the way power gets distributed?
While a lot of damage may have already been done, I don't ever think it's too late, because we've got to have the hope that we can get these legislation and, of course, certain things, regulation, of course, also deployed next to the technology. But we can't, there's always hope. There's always hope, and it is hope that keeps me in this space as well, and keeps me doing the things that I do, and keeps motivating me. The hope that we can have an informed public, the hope that we can have the requisite levels of public oversight when it comes to mass surveillance technologies, the hope that we can really bring an ethical approach to the design of new and emerging technologies, the hope that we can really steward data, the hope that we can really bring a trauma-informed perspective to understanding data, and understand the transmission of intergenerational trauma in it. So while damage may have been done, there is always hope to ensure that the protections go in place to ensure that no future damage is created and what has been done has been, can be repaired.
Mm-hmm. We have just a few minutes left before we take our break, and you've mentioned a phrase a few times that I think it's so important. I just ask you to expound on it a little bit for the sake of legibility for our audience, and that is trauma-informed knowledge. So, can you just explain the implications of that?
I think when we're looking at systems, and particularly this comes from criminal justice, where you've got to appreciate how trauma impacts systems and how trauma impacts decisions and often behavior. When we look at the history of data and we look at the discrimination and the bias that have been baked into our data sets, and we look at how certain groups were treated during the collection process of data and how data was analyzed or how data has been, classified, you understand there's an extraordinary amount of trauma. When you think of algorithms that have been used in the space of redlining, or algorithms that are designed, that are denying particular groups access to credit and mortgages and finances, and denying generations an opportunity to build wealth and to really build a solid future and to progress and for groups to develop. You understand the trauma that's created. A family denied resources becomes a family under an extraordinary amount of stress. A family under an extraordinary amount of stress may choose options that may not be healthy for that family to, move forward. So we've got to look at, when I say that, bringing that trauma-informed approach to data, looking at how these histories and these negative and misleading narratives inform the data. And as we move to find technical ways and new ways of thinking to debias data, we've also got to find ways to remove, or not even remove if we can't remove it, but understand that baked into this data is also trauma. And I think if we remove that, we could really find ways to make things a little more equitable when it comes to federal resources, when it comes to federal funding, when it comes to any kind of resources or access to those resources. Because if we do that, you would find that we're able to, close that wealth gap and really rethink and reimagine the ways we think about poverty, and deploy algorithms that really could benefit communities, build communities up, and not continue to pull groups down or keep groups in a particular space where they're not able to access all these great things we're supposed to access in a democracy. So that trauma-informed approach goes back to the historical roots of the data. It looks at how that, your in 2021, your data is your DNA, and it's going to continue to be your DNA as we move forward. And people are going to trace not only, the ways in which you think, but the things that you access, the ways in which you have accessed resources, so many things. So I think if we bring that trauma-informed approach, we are really able to bring a more equitable approach and a greater understanding of data. And now we could really reimagine technical ways and other ways of thinking about the ways in which we design new and emerging technologies and the impacts they would have on society, those long-term impacts.
Well, that's an inspiring note to end on. Really compelling and just incredibly rich and informative provocation for us to understand the connections among democratic institutions and the technology systems that are having just such an outsized impact on so many aspects of our lives, and the concern about social justice and what a humanistic, human-centered approach might mean for us to be able to take on some of these challenges. So thank you very much, Renee, for launching this conference for us. This has been very rich and thoughtful, and I think there's going to be a lot for us to continue to think about over the next few days with the conference. We want to remind all of our participants that we have a Slack channel that is on the Virginia Humanities Conference website, and it's also on the program for the conference. Feel free to join that Slack channel. We can use it to share our thoughts and questions and comments as we continue to think about some of the implications of Renee Cummings' talk and also of the larger themes of this conference. We're going to take a short break for, thank you. Trevor is placed in the chat for Zoom, the channel for that Slack channel. And we're going to take a short break for 15 minutes. We'll be back at 3:30 Eastern time. If you're presenting on a panel later, you can just keep your Zoom on and you can take your break with your audio and video turned off and just come back in to just return at 3:30. When we come back, you'll come back to this Zoom meeting room. We will have breakout rooms for you to pick the panel that you would like to attend. And you can just go into that breakout room by clicking the breakout button at the bottom of your screen. We will not be recording the panels. So we have recorded the keynote talk, but we will not be recording the panels. Someone had just asked that question. So we'll take a short break for 15 minutes. We'll be back at 3:30. And again, when you come back, you'll be able to click the breakout room and just pick the panel that you would like to attend. And we'll have the panels going for 75 minutes. At which point we'll be at 5 o'clock and we'll end at 5 today. We will resume tomorrow at 2 p.m. and you'll be using the same Zoom link to join the link tomorrow. Someone's asking where the keynote recording will be, so we'll be sure to place a link on the Virginia Humanities Conference site, but the Center for Humanities at Virginia Tech, which is hosting the event, will also have a link available on our YouTube page for the Center for Humanities. So we'll be sure to communicate with all of our conference attendees. So if you'd like to revisit this talk, there's quite a bit there to absorb. You'll know how to do that. So we're going to take a break now. It is 3:15 and we'll see you in 15 minutes. And again, thank you so much, Renee. Just an amazing, really evocative and provocative talk that is very effective in getting us to understand the connection among some of these issues. So we're really honored and delighted that you could be with us today. Thank you.
you.
All right.
Take care. Bye-bye.